Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Steven here, Northwest Small Batch Brewing. It is time for a weekly brew talk. This is my latest brew that's almost empty. I've almost kicked the keg. Believe it or not, this is a hazy IPA, but it's losing the haze because it's been in the keg long enough. It's actually started to settle out, and so it's clearing. But it still actually tastes really good. So, who cares? Anyway, today I want to talk about no Sparge Brewing. Man, there's so much to say about this. So I've been doing no Sparge Brewing for a very long time. It just eliminates a whole extra step. You don't need to heat up water separately. You don't have to calculate for all that. Of course, if you're using like a 3-tier system, it's just part of your process, right? But for those that are just getting into home brewing, man, unless you're brewing gigantic batches of beer, which I'm not going to get into too much because there are legal limits, even though it's probably not really regulated, but you know, no Sparge Brewing. I'm all about making the whole brewing process simple. Why make things difficult? So, full volume mash, I'll get into what it is in a second here, but basically it saves you a lot of time. It makes your pH more stable, believe it or not, because you don't end up over sparging the grains. If you over sparge the grains, we all know what sparging is, right? When you drain the grain and then you pour hot water, usually it's at 107 degrees Fahrenheit, slowly, like very slowly trickle it over your grain to rinse the grain of the sugars that are on it and raise your gravity. Realistically, if you're sparging, then you're actually, the amount of water you're using is a lot lower to begin with, right? You're going to end up basically watering down your beer. Yes, you're going to rinse some of that sugar off, but it's not the same. A lot of times you'll hear people say, I don't know how, you must not have as good efficiency because you do no Sparge Brewing. And I have just not found that to be true. In fact, the opposite, really, to be honest. At any rate, if you over sparge, meaning you pour too much hot water to rinse too much of your grains, it can actually lower the pH of your beer and cause astringency in your final product. So you've got the benefit of kind of maintaining your pH. I really don't even have to bother checking my pH on most of the beers I brew. Some beers you have to because it's just, that type of beer, it really is a requirement. But generally speaking, I don't have to. And it saves you a lot of time. So what is full volume mash, right? No Sparge Brewing. You use that normally in a full volume mash. Well, full volume mash means that you're using the entire amount of water for your entire brew day in one pot. So if you weren't doing that, you'd have to calculate with all these calculations and figure out, once you're done with mashing and rinsing and draining the grain, how much water do you need to still bring, your level of water up to account for the boil off. And then also try to calculate how much sugars you're gonna be able to rinse from those grains and see if you can hit those targets. In my opinion, it adds a lot of extra what ifs, like, what if you don't hit all that, calculation correctly, you're going to be off, basically. Your numbers are going to be off. Anyway, again, like I say, I think that's why this makes it so much easier. All you do, I'll even kind of run you through mine, right? So let's say I'm doing a 5-gallon batch of beer we're going to do a no Sparge, full volume mash. Get one pot, right? One pot. There's no need for a hot liquor tank. You don't have to heat like water off to the side in a different container to sparge with. All you need is one kettle, one container, right? It does have to be a larger kettle because you are filling it with more water than you maybe normally would. So it is a large kettle, but you're doing it all in one system. So if you're aiming for 5 gallons of beer, you start with that base. You know you're going to need at least 5 gallons of water. How much more than that do you need? Well, I have found that the grain absorption is pretty high, higher than you'd think. Usually about a gallon of water is lost just in grain absorption. So that is going to vary. Depends what kind of beer you're making. And if you're doing if you're using more grain, it's going to be more grain absorption than you would necessarily have. But on average, I'll just give you an on average, I would say that my grain absorbs about a gallon of liquid. So you're starting with 5 gallons because that's what you're making, a 5-gallon batch. You add a gallon that's going to be absorbed by the grain. So now we're up to 6 gallons of water in the kettle. You with me so far? All right. Now we have one more thing we need to account for, and that is the boil off. You're going to boil it. How much is going to be the angel's share, right? How much of the liquid is going to, dissipate into the air? Not as much as you think. If you are just doing an open, kettle boil where you're just boiling without a lid, you should never boil with a lid fully on, but you can have it just cracked and it still works fine. But the amount of steam that might boil off might change in that case. In my case, I use a condensation lid, and I have very little boil off. There is obviously some, but not as much. At any rate, normal boil off, from my experience, is a half a gallon. If you're doing 5 gallons of beer, it's half a gallon. So you add a half. So we were at 6. We're at a half gallon for the boil off. Now we're at 6.5 gallons. So as a general rule of thumb, I know that I'm going to be around 6.5 gallons of water if I want a 5-gallon batch of beer. I usually do a half gallon more than that so that I can I can attribute, the wort or the protein coagulation at the bottom of the kettle that I'm not going to keep, and the trube in the fermenter. So I usually do a little extra half gallon in my recipes just to account for that. So we'll just say if I do that, 7 gallons. I'm making 7 gallons to get a 5.5 gallon batch at the end. So that's how you have to calculate it. You kind of move backwards to figure out how much water you start with, and then you end with where you want to be. Realistically, you want to undershoot so that you're just a little under. Like if I'm under 5 gallons or whatever my final is supposed to be, I can always top up depending on what my final numbers are. It's very hard. It's not hard, but it's a pain to go the other direction because then you just have to boil it longer. I'd rather be just slightly under on the numbers personally. So that's it. That's a full volume mash. Look, you have a high water to grain ratio with a full volume mash, right? There's a lot more water to the amount of grain you have. That means you get more complete conversion and better attenuation. So you get that benefit from it. So all in all, you save time, you get better attenuation and better conversion, and the pH ends up not being as big an issue. So all in all, if you can do a no sparge full volume mash, I highly recommend it. Hey, I'll be back in another week with another topic, another brew day, another hot tip. Whatever it is, I'll be here. I'll see you, and keep on brewing. Cheers.